Checking. Same designation as before. It's definitely Hallis Hope.
We recently had the chance to get a hands-on with Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, the latest single-player cosmic comic book-inspired adventure from Eidos Montreal. We weren't able to capture any of our gameplay, but we were provided some B-roll of the same demo by Square Enix, so that's what you're seeing right now. Our hands-on was about an hour long and took place in Chapter 5 of the game. The Guardians are locked in a bit of a legal dispute with the Nova Corps, to whom they owe a pretty big fine, so they're headed to the Spirit of Xandar, aka The Rock, a Nova outpost, to smooth things over. Prior to this point in the story, they've been in contact with Ko-Rel, a Nova Centurion, and her daughter Nikki, who asks for the team's help at the Rock as something strange seems to be going on there. Now, side note, there are two distinct comic book characters with Guardians of the Galaxy and Nova Corps affiliations with these names, but they are somewhat different and reimagined for the game. Just something to bear in mind. Anyway, before the team head out for the Rock, you're able to spend some time with them in their ship, the Milano. Here, you can wander around, play songs on the jukebox, have Rocket craft perks from components you've picked up on adventures, or explore your teammates' rooms and interact with their belongings to find out a little bit more about them. It's clear that this is a very different take on some characters than the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Several stories are more akin to classic comic book arcs. For example, this version of Thanos, who Gamora mentions briefly, is in love with Lady Death, literally the physical embodiment of death, which is what drives him to do the things that he does. Peter Quill, meanwhile, is traditionally the heir to the Spartax Empire, which he also mentions casually in conversation on the Milano, as you do. Some things the game does change up or give its own spin on, however. This game reimagines Quill's moniker Star-Lord as an 80s band he idolizes. And the team at Eidos Montreal actually created an entire extremely 80s sounding hair metal Star-Lord album from scratch, which is played throughout the game. The Milano is a great looking space that does well to expand on each character's personality via their own individual little areas. But the way in which dialogue is opened up with your teammates often feels a little bit wooden. You pick up an item and they just kind of appear behind you, ready to reel off some exposition with a couple of basic dialogue options. I'm sure it doesn't help that this game was made in the midst of a pandemic, but the voice acting can come across as technically and emotionally uneven in these moments. And it makes a lot of interesting, admittedly optional backstory a bit of a slog to get through.
I see you have discovered my criminal record.
The aforementioned workbench is a handy spot on the ship where you can trade in crafting parts for equipment upgrades and perks designed and built by Rocket. Crafting parts will be hidden throughout the world as you explore, and generally speaking, it doesn't seem too difficult to stay stocked up. The development team said of the perks that they didn't want players to worry about missing out on anything special, and so they designed perks specifically as upgrades to stuff that you'll already have unlocked. They'll offer faster cooldowns and health stamina regen, for example. They'll allow you to float in the air that little bit longer, and so on. I mean, it's a nice idea to keep things accessible, but we do hope it doesn't ultimately make the perk system feel a little bit shallow in the final game. Once the team hyperjumps through space in their own vibrantly neon way, they arrive at the Rock. The Milano is clamped and docked, which is apparently standard procedure for the Nova Corps, and they proceed to explore the bizarrely deserted outpost. There are no Centurions to be seen at first, just robots running on autopilot. Though, the Guardians do come across Jack Flag still trapped in a holding cell, and the player is given a choice whether to try and release him or not. We weren't able to see any kind of resolution to this choice, but our guess is it'll open up gently deviating storylines later in the game. There are actually a few moments like this in the demo, where choices are offered up with the potential to change the course of your story. The biggest one, in an immediate sense, was when the team came across an abandoned Centurion helmet, and putting it on his head, Quill can hear comms from the other end. So you can choose to either engage the voices or stay silent, which will impact how the Guardians enter into battle a little bit later on. Choosing not to speak means that they're able to get the jump on the enemies, but speaking into it, as we did, means that they very kindly come to you under the guise of being helpful. Once they arrive though, it becomes very clear that something is not right. If their brainwashed way of speaking didn't give them away, then their eerie purple aura definitely would. It's here that the demo finally launched us into combat. You control Star-Lord exclusively, but can issue orders to the other team members, who each have their own areas of speciality. Drax does the most stagger damage to enemies, Gamora does the most health damage, and Groot immobilizes enemies with his vines, while Rocket can do damage from afar and also initiate AoE attacks. As Quill, you can use your jet boots to zoom around the battlefield. You can get in close for punchy melee attacks, and you can add elemental damage to your pistols. Ice seemed to work best against the waves of entranced Nova Corps. Melee attacks can hit hard, but they also come with the possibility that foes will retaliate. Some of the core that we faced off against would stop our punches mid-strike and send another back at us, giving us a very fleeting opportunity to hit a button at the right time and recover, or be knocked flat on our butt. There are similar skill checks in place with your pistols. They technically have unlimited ammo, but in the grand tradition of futuristic weaponry, they can overheat. When this happens, a moving gauge will appear over your reticule, and if pressed at the right time, you'll override the overheat and be able to keep firing, basically indefinitely. Misfire and you'll be without your weapons for a few seconds. Enemies have a secondary stagger bar underneath their health bar, and when that's filled, they will be momentarily completely immobilized. Some enemies will also have additional shields that you'll need to figure out how to bypass too. While in combat, you build up momentum, which is visible by a bar on the left side of the screen. Building this means you're more likely to trigger a call to action, a collaborative flare attack from one of the other Guardians, generally executed on PlayStation by pressing triangle and circle together. Team flares are also triggerable, and they see the Guardians essentially all gang up to bully one perfo in particular. On top of that, there are opportunities for Quill to order teammates to trigger environmental attacks like flinging exploding red barrels at enemies or dropping some scaffolding on their head. Then you have the Huddle, a sort of ultimate attack that you'll eventually activate by pressing L1 and R1 together at the right time. This will then bring you out of the fight entirely, putting you into Quill's first-person view as the other Guardians literally huddle or all crowd around you. They'll then speak a few quick statements, with some of their spoken words literally appearing on the screen. You then have to assess their current emotional state and choose a reply that will suitably invigorate them, pull them in line, or otherwise inspire everyone to keep going. Choose the correct option, and once you get back into the fight, Star-Lord will turn up his music and everyone's damage will be temporarily doubled. Choose incorrectly and only Quill's will be. Honestly, it's kind of an odd choice in a game that literally has a momentum gauge to pull you out of your flow for a few seconds for a multiple choice conversation before letting you back into the fight. And we're not entirely sure that it works. But if the double damage boost doesn't inspire you to keep going, then the soundtrack definitely will. Now, if that combat breakdown all sounds like a lot, that's because it is. It was extremely overwhelming, and it didn't really help that our demo was a little ways into the game and we weren't able to warm up with a bit of a tutorial beforehand. Once the Guardians started fighting on the rock, there were waves upon waves of enemies to get through, and it just felt like there was a bit too much happening at any one time, even with time slowed down slightly when you're in a menu to issue orders to teammates. In all honesty, it's not that bit that's particularly confusing. They each simply have a different attack mapped to each of your controller's face buttons. It's just that there's so many different microsystems at play, and none of them seemed to really click together all that well. That lack of cohesion also stretched to the Guardians themselves. It seems like the team can never really agree on whether they're using their indoor or outdoor voices in any given conversation, and as a result, it feels like there's not much chemistry to the group. Gamora, in particular, falls pretty flat compared to other incarnations of the deadliest woman in the galaxy.
Now what?
During the demo, Peter and Rocket have had a falling out, and thus they are constantly sniping at one another. Now, it's understandable that the developer wants to build this idea of a team that's still finding their feet and finding a way to work with one another, but in this section at least, it's just irritating, and it's hard to see why they'd bother sticking together at all.
Get back here with my ship!
Eventually, the Guardians discover that an enigmatic cult known as the Universal Church of Truth, led by a very mysterious figure known as the Matriarch, are performing weird ritualistic ceremonies at the Rock. And so, like any sensible people, they decide to get on out of there. But first, they need to fight through waves of enemies to release the Milano from 6 clamps holding her to the docking bay. The development team ambitiously refer to sequences like this as comsols, combat sequences that have additional puzzle objectives to complete simultaneously, such as shooting the clamps off the Milano. After each battle, you'll receive XP that goes towards ability points that can be spent on any of the Guardians, including Quill. Now, there weren't really many mechanical elements on offer in this short gameplay demo of Guardians of the Galaxy that we hadn't seen before. Some environmental puzzles or obstacles had Quill either asking a teammate to open the way, sometimes you had to ask them twice before the story could progress, or using the elemental aspects of his guns to, for example, freeze a doorway in place. It's all pretty standard stuff, so it's kind of a shame that these exploration sequences also didn't really allow for getting to know the team better. There was some repeating dialogue and a couple of minor audio glitches. That said, it's important to note that this is still a work in progress and a project that's been worked on throughout the pandemic, so some small issues are to be expected.
Are these
Centurion armor!
Yup. Feel free to try one on, Quill.
A true warrior requires no armor.
You wouldn't fit in one anyway.
There's definitely potential there with Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. It's certainly done its homework as far as the comics are concerned. There's even a character bio page in the menu that delves into everyone's publication history, but the demo we played was hamstrung by pacing issues, a steep learning curve and slightly too chaotic combat, and the as yet unconvincing chemistry of its main players. It's one thing to be dysfunctional, but we've yet to see the Guardians of the Galaxy really put the fun back in there. So let us know what you think. Are you going to be picking this up at launch, or are you going to wait until you see more of the game? As always, subscribe to Eurogamer if you haven't already to keep up to date with this and every other game coming out, because we have a brand new video every single day, so there is always something new to watch. Otherwise, we will see you again very, very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye!
You have proven yourselves unworthy, and you must be destroyed!